I am a polyamorous person, right? In a mostly monogamous relationship.
Okay.
Our relationship started off as like being open. We started off as like completely open. And we decided after about a year and a half to kind of close our relationship, which was like for me as someone who is like likes freedom and like sexual freedom was actually quite a big decision for myself.
Welcome to the Ask Ezra Intimacy Coaching Podcast, a peek behind the curtain of some of the most intimate conversations that people have with Ezra as an intimacy coach. Join us for a session already in progress.
So I've been running a podcast now for, I think it's 4 years, over 4 years, 4 years.
Wow.
And it's called, it's changed name, but now it's settled in the name, which is The Authentic Man with David Chambers, myself. And really the podcast is kind of aimed at men and helping men in the realms of dating, relationships and intimacy and all the bits and pieces that affect those areas of their lives. I'm really a big proponent of like healthy masculinity and how that can really improve men's lives in all aspects. But I'm finding that, all sorts of people are landing on my podcast and listening. I regularly work with my partner. She mainly works with women, so I work with some of her clients sometimes. And I often send them episodes of my podcast because they find it useful to understand men and what they're going through so they can better kind of more equipped when it comes to dating and relationship.
Wow. So you are partnered with someone who's also a coach.
Yeah.
Wow. I like to imagine you guys must have the most sophisticated arguments.
sometimes we have really sophisticated arguments. And then I think we also have lots of really stupid and like playful moments as well.
Yeah.
Like where I'll say something and she'll be like, my abandonment wound is activated. And I'm like, I feel like you're telling me off like you're my mother. I'm going to my room. We'll kind of play in that way.
There you go.
We can't be serious all the time.
No, you can't. And I think it's interesting too, because there's this expectation that, an intimacy professional, a therapist, a psychiatrist, they're supposed to be like flawless. And it's the farthest thing from the truth. Like I think the reason that we get into these spaces is because we're working on stuff, and so we're really drawn to it, and we're drawn to people who are also working on stuff because then we feel less alone. And like my vision is that I'm helping people on a similar path to me. I don't have to be done with my pathway. I'm just a little farther along and say, hey, the road ahead is fine, let's go, keep coming, right? So
yeah it's like, I still have my stuff, and I'm still working on my stuff. My stuff still comes up on a daily, weekly basis, and I have to work on it, right? I have to notice it and I have to pay attention. I have to apologize for things. We are far from perfect in our relationship, but as you said, like we have gone through many of the trials and tribulations that other people are now facing. And we try and give them some signposts to like, no, go down that road. No, don't go down that road because that road is really rocky and there's a dragon down there. And you can go down that road where the dragon is. It's cool, but you're going to come back to where we are now. And sometimes they go down the road where the dragon is. They go down there and then they come back up and they're like, oh, we didn't do the thing that we spoke about that I said was a good thing at the time. And like we had this, if it's a couple working with, we had terrible arguments and I feel horrible and they feel horrible. And you're like, okay, so what would you like to try now? They're like, should we go down that road that you were talking about? You're like, yeah.
How brave of you to recount a story when you were right. I was going to say, I have another joke. That dragon's my wife. So shades of Shrek, right? I joke. So tell me, David, like, who is your favorite client? Like, what do they seem like? Who's the person who you walk in, you go, great, another one of these guys, let's go?
That's a really good question. I have some kind of cryptic list of my clients on the wall because I don't want to give any particular details around. So there's like a couple of initials. Um, I think that my favorite client is my favorite type of client. The first favorite is this sort of man who is struggling to communicate his feelings and emotions inside of his relationship, right? For whatever reason that is, but he's struggling to, and it's usually, they don't have the language, they're not aware of what they're feeling. There's some sort of blockage that they're experiencing. So that's one of my favorite clients because those are the guys who you're like, oh man, I almost feel a bit envious of them, right? Because I'm a bit like, man, your life is going to be so much better in about a year to 18 months time. And you just don't know that right now. Though I can't tell them that also it might feel slightly more painful along the way, but and I'm seeing them kind of evolve and open up because, those sorts of guys, there's a whole tapestry of life that they haven't really experienced because they haven't really been feeling life. They haven't looked at a plant and stopped for 5 minutes and been like, wow, that plant is beautiful. That's stunning. The plant, the colors, they've never really stopped to do that because they're often either they've just been working or they've been plowing ahead with their lives, but they've not really taken the time to really feel much of life and be able to kind of express it. So along the journey with those guys, it's really beautiful because, they start to have conversations with friends and family and they're like, wow, I didn't realize that my grandma had lived through this whole age of being, and she told me this story and I listened to and I felt her pain and I felt her surprise and I felt her laughter. It's as if sometimes they were living their whole lives in black and white. And when they start to feel what there is about life and feel what they're feeling themselves, their own pain, their own joy, they start to get some color in and they start to be really wowed by, what life has to offer, what relationships have to offer, what intimacy has to offer for them.
Wow. Yeah, that's really powerful. And I can relate. I personally spent a long time gray rocking. Are you familiar with that
No.
topic? Okay. So gray rocking is a defense mechanism in the presence of a narcissist. So by being uninteresting, you become less of a target, right?
Wow.
So be a gray rock and no one will notice, right? And what that translates to in real life, I mean, it's a defense mechanism, right? And it works, and that's why we do it. But the problem is, when is it time to shut it off, right? When is it safe to be colorful again? When is it safe to be, to be vivacious? And it took me maybe 15 years after I was no longer in the presence of this narcissist to really be like, oh, like I can choose to be out loud. I can choose to be like really colorful. And part of that was not actually feeling my feelings in the first place, right? Because if I don't have any feelings, I can't be attacked for having those feelings, right? And so I liken it to my radio station was just not dialed in. Sometimes you have the radio station, but you have just the wrong number. So you can hear it, but there's like a lot of static. And you switch just one number, two numbers over, and all of a sudden there it is, and it's loud. And so I had my stereo, my figurative stereo, all the way up to 10 because I was trying to listen through the static. Right. But it was really tough. And so I was doing all these body mapping exercises as part of my sex coach training. And I was like, I don't feel anything. How come I don't feel anything? Like, I guess I feel sad. I guess I feel this. And I was like, wait a minute. And I was able to sort of clear that away. And then everything was at 10 and crystal clear. And I had to turn that volume back down and say, okay, okay, we got to calm down a little bit. But I totally get that. And that, how can you communicate about feelings that you aren't even aware that you're having? Right.
Exactly.
So I feel that.
Yeah. What was your journey after that to go from where everything was a 10 to kind of bring it down to where it was, it fluctuated from, 3s to 10s?
Yeah, sure. So the process was about desensitization. And when you feel something super intense, sometimes there is this impulse to hide or run away or distract. And those only contribute to the sensitivity. So it was really leaning into those feelings and saying, okay, it's going to be a 10 for a little while. Let's feel this as a 10. And then it subsided, as I got a chance to sort of feel those feelings fully and let them be a little bit overwhelming at times. And then, gradually over a course of several months, it became less intense. It happened. It's like you lose perspective, right? If like I imagine you've got like you're really farsighted or really nearsighted, and all of a sudden you get glasses on, you're like, oh my God, there's stuff everywhere. You got to have a chance to sort of acclimate to that new reality. So that's part of my journey, but we're not here to talk about me, David. You're doing too good of your job. We're here to talk about you, David. My listeners know too much about me already, I'm sure. But okay, so I want to hear what are specific to the podcast, and this is not research, but specific to the podcast, what are your challenges? What has been hard? I mean, you mentioned some like 150 some episodes, right? That's a tremendous accomplishment. So, what has been the struggle, the challenge along the road?
Yeah, I think the first kind of 20, 30 episodes. No, the first 10 episodes are like, whoa, I've got a podcast. I put a podcast out into the world. And then there's like a time, I think, between like 10 and maybe like 30. And you're like, but hardly anyone's listening to the podcast. How do I get more people to listen to the podcast? That was kind of a worry. Like, I'm putting all this energy and I think this is amazing stuff. And being with the feeling of, right, it's not necessarily to change it, but it's like being with the feeling of like, of the lack of like, it's not landing for people, or it's not hitting all the people I want. Like, it's almost like a sadness, isn't it? It's like I'm putting my heart into something and I want it to be more. I'm like being with that feeling of it, like being with the feeling of the sadness around that, like, okay. And being okay with that, right? Being with the reality of like, this is how something grows, right? Something starts off small and then it grows, and learning to be with that at kind of an okay level, especially around like achievement, because I can definitely see where like I grew up and always wanting to like be the best and achieve well and hit top marks, and just being with that and just being with like, this is a slow process. In the podcast. What other challenges? I think a challenge that even recently I've been up against is like, how am I going to make best use of all this content in the podcast? I say all these wonderful things and I speak to all these wonderful guests, and it just kind of stays in audio world where like people will listen to the whole episode or not. And, we live in a world now where everything's like 30 seconds. Everyone wants everything in 30 seconds and with flashy GIFs and popping images, So it's like, how can I bring a bit more of that like long form into the short form? So that's also been a challenge. And consistency. You've got to put a lot of energy in. I think I haven't counted how many episodes, but it must be outputs of 150. And it's just like consistently showing up for it as well. And I think one of the challenges actually, and this was one probably definitely early on, is almost trying to script the whole thing, like wanting to script it too much. And like, the more I've podcasted, the less I script, the more it's just like I might start off with 10 questions that have just come to me from speaking, like looking at someone's content or so forth, or knowing their profile, and letting go of the idea I need to actually ask them most of those questions. Because the number of times that I've spoken to people and I've looked back at my list and I'm like, I asked 2 of those 10 questions, and the podcast is wonderful. So I think that's something that has been really good, is like having that guideline, but also just really letting things flow, which kind of works for me because that's kind of like how I am as a kind of conversationalist. And it kind of ties in a lot actually with what I'm always telling men to do. It's like, don't go in, dating especially, it's like, don't go in with this idea of like how it has to go or how it has to be. Be with the moment and the natural flow of things. And things will be far more at ease, because when two people are interacting in a conversation, it's like, it's not an interview. No, it's not an interview, but it's like an unfolding, you know, it's an interaction, and the moment by moment interaction dictates the next moment and the moment after that. And that's how it kind of flows. And that's what makes it a beautiful interaction between two or more people.
Some of my dates are like interviews, but I tend to date very submissive humans. And so they just expect you to take the lead on every interaction. It's exhausting unless you know exactly what you want, and then you get it because they're like, sure, whatever you want. That's hot. That's super hot to me. I was going to say, perfect opportunity to mention that the Ask Ezra podcast is available on YouTube. So you can see my face and you can see David's face too. So that's an option. If you're listening somewhere, then you can watch too. And I love that scripted issue sort of thing, right? So like, make a script and forget it. It's kind of like, so you can feel really well prepared. And that makes so much sense with the dating reference, because so much of great sex is being okay with not knowing, or, you know, being flexible, right? And so if you come into a date space with like rigid, like, excuse me, we're supposed to be on question 6, then, you know, you're just demonstrating you're going to be terrible in bed.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, and I'm with you there. I mean, I think I don't have any challenge with like a scripted compulsion. Like I am totally fine to like leave the script aside, but yeah, that wondering if I'm doing the right thing, if I'm appealing to the right people, is challenging. So if you're listening, please comment and tell me how much you love my stuff, please, desperately. Because it feels like shouting into the void, at least for, you know, the beginning. It just feels like, you know, I'm just out here on the soapbox in an empty city square, right? So
yeah, because you just, for a long time, you're like putting stuff out, you're putting a lot of energy in behind it, and you're like, is this helping anybody? Is anyone listening? It's like, is anyone listening? Or I guess you could look at it this way: if a podcaster is podcasting in the forest and there's no one there to listen and no one there to comment back, did anyone hear them podcasting?
Yeah. Well, okay, I'll tell you 2 reasons why I know people are listening. And I say this on episode 30 something, maybe I'm at 40 by the time this publishes, but I get 2 responses from people that in real life that like I'm meeting on Zoom or on the phone or like in person. I get either, I wasn't sure if I wanted to work with you, so I checked out the podcast. And that's wonderful. That's part of the purpose of the podcast, is like you get to kind of vet me a little bit. But the other thing that really sets my soul on fire is people go, I felt so alone. I felt so unsure of how to move forward until I listened to your podcast and heard from someone who is having a similar experience to me. And that just melts my icy heart. So, so,
Yeah,
and honestly,
difference.
Yeah, and if it does those 2 things and never takes off, like, okay, fine, sure. You know, do I want it to take off? Absolutely. Please like, share, and comment. There's more action items in this podcast than I swear any other podcast. I never tell people to do anything. If you like the Ask Ezra podcast, then let me know. Comment on your favorite episode. Let us know what you enjoyed or what you'd like to see more of. Okay, I want to get back to you, David. So tell me, you mentioned your partner's a coach as well. Tell me about you. Are you monogamous? Are you heterosexual? Are you straight down the line? Who's David?
Yeah, God, who's David? I would say I am heterosexual male. I would say that I am a polyamorous person, right? In a mostly monogamous relationship.
Okay.
Our relationship started off as like being open. We started off as like completely open, open relating. And we decided after about a year and a half to kind of close our relationship, which was like, for me as someone who is likes freedom and like sexual freedom, was actually quite a big decision for myself. But we're kind of exploring at the moment, like, okay, would we like to play with other people? Like, how would we like that to look? Would we like to go to, both of us have been to sex clubs before independently, in our past before meeting each other. So we're like, okay, we want to do that together. So it's like, okay, how do we feel about bringing somebody else in? Like, what are the boundaries? How fast and slow do we want to go? So that's like quite a lot of conversation that we're having between us in our relationship around that. And that's been really exciting, also daunting, also triggering at times as well for both of us. Like, it brings up different wounds, which is really fascinating actually, because it's like, was it like a couple of weeks ago, we met up with a couple, and the kind of idea was like, oh, we're just going to have a drink. They were visiting where we live here in Portugal. And it was like, okay, she said something to me like before we went in, and then I reacted in my wounded way by shutting down and not talking. But it was like, oh yeah, I can see what's happening here. This is like the one area where we can trigger each other quite easily, because I'm like, this is going too slow. I want to be with other women now, kind of thing. Well, not necessarily out loud. And she's more like, oh, let's take it slow, let's take it slow. So it's like, it's a real balance that we're striking in this area of our relationship.
I hear you. And I don't want to make light of it, but I've heard you go slow first and then you go fast. Bad joke. I couldn't help myself. Yeah, but I mean, I think that also has like precedent in relationship things. Like if she's asking you to go slow, then going slow is the best way to get to going fast, because you're establishing that trust. And yeah. So that's really interesting. So what I'm hearing from you is that you started in this open relationship, and as things got serious, you decided to close it up. And then now you're opening up again tentatively. Yeah. How much time? So you mentioned like a year and a half before closing up. How long did you spend closed before you started opening up again?
So we've been together now total like 3.5 years. So it's probably been like 2 years now.
Okay.
2 years now that we've been closed. And it's why it's really interesting is like what happened was, before I met my partner, I was like open relating for like a good year or so. So it was like, I was like, this is me. I'm an open person. Like, I don't want these kind of boundaries and so forth. And then we met. She was like, yeah, I'm down with that too. And then what we quickly realized was that I had a lot more experience in this and she didn't. And it meant that I was just kind of living my life and having very straight conversations about, I've been with this person. Like we had an agreement of like being honest about it. Like, oh, if you've seen someone, we have a conversation about it afterwards.
Yeah.
And actually what that created for her was a lot of anxiety. And initially for like probably the first 6 months plus, she was like, I can manage this. It's just new. This is something new. And because she didn't expect that she would have this anxiety, because in the past she'd been a bit more distant and a bit more maybe avoidant within relationships. But as we were getting closer and I was being with other people and she was sometimes being with other people, it was creating more kind of anxiety for her in general. So it was a constant conversation of like, okay, like, how are you feeling? What do you need? How's this landing for you? And then I think what became obvious was like, for me, on my side, was I'd always wanted this like, oh my God, I want to be able to have sex with anyone whenever I want type of thing. And what I started to see is like, as I was being kind of quote unquote allowed to in the relationship, I felt less desire and need to. So as things kind of went on, I was like, okay. I remember there was a few times where my partner would like go away for the weekend and I'd be like, awesome. Like, she's not around. Like, oh yeah, I have a bit of free time. Like, okay, there's, that girl that I've seen a few times, so I enjoy seeing. Maybe I'm going to go and see her. Then I would kind of stop and be like, yeah, I could do, but I could also just sit here and do absolutely nothing and just watch TV all weekend. That would also be really nice. And I'd have to kind of feel in and go, what is it that I really want? Like, what is the, now that it no longer had this kind of novelty or what's the point of the word I want, is like it being something that was like highly prized. It was just kind of a normal part of the relationship. I started to realize that my desire for kind of being open was a lot less than it was before, when it was kind of like quote unquote forbidden fruit, so I just found that it kind of settled. And there was a point where she was like, I feel that our relationship could go deeper if we close the relationship. And I remember where we had that conversation, and I was like, I remember I went away to the forest. Actually, I went and sat in the forest for about 4 hours and like really thought about it and thought about what I wanted and where I wanted the relationship to go. And I was like, okay, you know what? I'm willing to put that thing that I want to one side for the good of the relationship and deepening the relationship and love that we have. And it was only, we kind of said that, and I was like, but I just want to know, this conversation is never dead, right? It's never going to be like, we're never going to have this conversation again. And she was like, no, totally. But just for this, for this, like it was midway through lockdown. So it's like, just for these months periods and so forth. And I was like, cool. I was like, I can live with that. I'm fine with that. I'm happy with that. And then it also kind of coincided not long after that I suddenly, I left my job and became a coach full time. So I suddenly had far less time. And it was interesting to see, like, when you have less time and you're more stressed, that my appetite for just being with other people really diminished a lot. Actually went down quite a bit. And the last kind of 6 months, we've been having conversation about opening up a bit more. And yeah, it's something that we're taking slowly and surely and kind of consciously doing through conversation about, scenarios and stuff, but also making sure that both of us are comfortable and happy, which it feels like, the most important thing is like, are we both comfortable and happy? Because it's much better to go slow, as you were saying, and making sure that like we're checking in with each other, we both feel safe, we both feel happy, because then it's like, then it creates more freedom later on. Whereas it's quite easy, we could move too quickly now, and it could really create a bit of a wound between the two of us, or, some sort of damage in the relationship. And that's the thing we very much don't want.
Yeah, it's much easier to build trust than it is to rebuild trust.
Yes.
So yeah. And what I'm hearing too is that this person is really a priority for you.
Yeah. I must say, for maybe one of the first times in my life that I'm like with a partner who I'm like, this person is like, we want to build a life together. We're building a life together, and making all the plans and so forth. And I've maybe stepped out of thinking about just me and what I want. I think for a lot of years, my whole thing about relationships was like, well, I want this, and the relationship's not let me have this. So either I get what I want or you get what you want. Whereas I think now I've definitely softened into like, okay, there's compromise and there's to and fro on both sides. And like, what's best for the relationship longer term? What's best for me? And those things are a lot more closely aligned than definitely were in past relationships.
Sure. And how old are you, David? If you don't mind me asking.
38.
38. Okay, yeah, I'm right behind you, 37 at the time of recording. So but yeah, no, I mean, I think it takes till your 30s to really figure out like how to chill out and how to assess that like long-term compatibility stuff, right? That's what it feels like to me. Maybe there's other people out there that are smarter than me, so I'm not going to put anybody down, but yeah, that's really
it's
interesting.
Like a maturing as well, right? It's like a maturing that needs to happen. And I think, for me, that maturing didn't really kick in until I was like in my kind of late 20s, like, 28, 29 ish, and really come to fruition probably kind of midway through my 30s. I just wasn't, there's a selfishness actually, I think for me personally, there was just a lot of selfishness, and I think that spawned out of probably a childhood where I felt like I wasn't getting what I wanted and I had to sacrifice the things I wanted because things weren't available. So I think when I got to an age where I could do everything I wanted for myself, the independence, the selfishness came along with it. It's like, I want what I want. I want mine. I want mine was kind of like the way I was for many years. And, that was great. I learned a lot of things from that. But I think there was a point where I just kind of matured out of the kind of small I and started to think a bit wider and bigger about what I wanted my life to mean and what I wanted to create with, the, not so much the resources, but like the knowledge as well that I've gathered. Like, do I want to just keep like sleeping with lots of women in short relationships, which was most of my 20s? Or do I want to like create a family based on the knowledge and wisdom that I've grown? I can kind of keep doing that 20-year-old thing until I'm 50 if I wanted to, right?
But you can keep doing it until you're 100 if you eat right and exercise.
Maybe get some stem cells in my knees and stuff like that. I could quite easily, right?
Yeah.
But I was like, what do I want to do with my life? What I really want to do with my life? And I started to see like, actually, just like running around, or as one of my kind of mentors would say, is like being the oldest swinger in the bar. She's like, do you want to always be the oldest swinger in the bar? And, you can keep having that same experience, because the short relationships I was having at one point in my life was like, it was kind of the same experience again and again, but just like that slightly different feeling of a different person, right? And I started to see that actually I felt a bit empty doing that. So I guess maturing into my 30s was like, I'm thinking a bit bigger. I started to think a bit bigger and a bit more long-term about what I wanted to create, what I wanted to do with my life. And it just, like you said, I think it is it's funny how you say it's like, smart people wait until their 30s, but go back 300 years, those people would have been dead from some strange disease that didn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And they would have had
absolutely.
babies.
Yeah, for the vast majority of human history, like 40 is old. Right. It's only in the last, the last 1,000 years is a very small portion of human history. So
exactly.
Anyway, I kind of did it the other way around, right? I mean, I was in my 20s and I said, honestly, my story is more like nobody's going to accept me for as kinky as I am, or anybody who does is like not going to be a whole and healthy person, which is really the most tragic misunderstanding of my life. And then eventually I realized, being kinky is really a big part of me, and I can't just keep this in the closet. So now it's an endless parade of women. But I'm just being silly here. So, and I love that you're talking about how like being restrained almost fed your appetite. There's a GIF somewhere out in the universe of like two dogs barking at each other on either side of a gate, and it's an automatic gate, and they open the gate and the dogs just like stop barking and look at each other. And then the gate goes back and they start barking again, And I think that's how it is sometimes when we have boundaries that aren't right for us, is that, when that boundary exists, there's all this noise because deep down, we know that that's not the right boundary for us. And then when the boundary's gone, we go, okay, well, like I didn't need to go out. I just needed the option. Right.
Yes.
So I hear that for sure. So what else comes up for you with your partner? I mean, what is really, you sort of talked about the past leading to the present. So what's currently coming up for you now? I mean, is that sort of open, closed transition all consuming, or is, you mentioned some wounds, but what's going on for you right now?
Now I think now the biggest thing for us is managing like our work commitments and our relationship, because she's also a coach, I'm a coach, and she's probably, not to say like she's a year longer in kind of full-time coaching than I am. So it's like being in that phase of like building business and working, I find myself working like 6 days a week sometimes, and when you're working a lot, is you find yourself in this, can often be quite a analytical mindset, even though, when I'm coaching, I'm listening to people and I'm looking for the in-between parts. So to then go into your relationship and bring kind of love and softness and openness and, you know, playfulness and all the things that kind of feed a relationship really well, opposed to kind of going in with logic and, I'm going to say mindlessness, but I'm kind of describing that in like kind of having your mind half on something else, you know, like a bit of work that you've just finished off isn't always conducive from like developing a deep intimacy. So it's like, but also on, you know, my partner's side, it's also having kind of support and understanding. And that's something that I think we talk about a lot. It's like she can be super understanding to the fact that I will fall down rabbit holes of working until like 10:30 at night when I've said that I'll be done at like 8 o'clock. And she'll be like, she'll just come in and go to the door back there and go to me, I'm going to go to bed. And then I'm like, oh, and then I feel like I'm being told off. And I'm like, oh, I'm really sorry. And she's like, no, it's fine. And I'm like, no, she's covertly telling me off, but she's not really saying it. So then I'm like checking and I'll be like, are you okay? Is everything okay? She's like, it's fine. Like, if you need to work, but make sure you should go to bed soon because it's late. Like, and kind of navigating that as well is like an endless thing, because also then we need to make time for stuff like, okay, on the day of recording now, it's Valentine's Day. So it's like, oh, actually, let's consciously spend some time, the whole evening together where we finish working and we just like, you know, I think we'll go for a walk in the evening and just spend some time where there's no demand. We don't have to do anything. We can just lie together in bed and, you know, eat strawberries off each other or something like that. Who knows? Or we haven't decided. But it's like making that time consciously and choosing to make that time in between all the work and the stuff that has to happen. That is, and it's a challenge, right? But it's also, it can also be fun. It doesn't have to, challenges don't have to be always challenging. They can also be interesting and fun and insightful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is the fact that you're both coaches can be a real deterrent to intimacy, ironically. You know, because being intimate is not the same as coaching intimately, for sure. Yeah. And if you go in with that analytical mindset, then it can prevent you from being present. Yeah,
totally does.
I hear you. I'm just like acknowledging and validating here, like, you got it. You know what you got to do. So I hear you. And yeah, that's challenging. And, you know, we were talking a little bit earlier about, you know, having these tools. It doesn't make life easier necessarily. Like, yes, we can communicate really exceptionally, but, you know, we're still people and we still get triggered. And, you know, it sounds like, you know, she's doing a tremendous job of making space for you, and I can only assume you're doing your best and also doing a tremendous job of making space for her and her challenges. So yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. And I think it's funny. We were talking about this a couple of days ago. Like, she was in this phase of working like a couple of years ago, you know, and I saw it where she was like waking up early, working all day long. And in those times, we were like in a 1-bedroom flat. So it was, you know, difficult, COVID and so forth. But I was doing things like, okay, looking after like food, making sure there was food to eat and all those kind of supporting things to support her in what she was creating. And it's interesting how the roles have not maybe completely changed, but they flip round. And she's really giving me the support I need to grow in the way through my business in this way. And there's been very little resentment from either of us around this. Like, there's been like clear communication, like, I would really love to spend time with you this weekend. Like, do you have any time, kind of thing? But there's just this kind of acknowledgement and understanding, which means that we don't get into kind of the blame and pointing finger arguments that can quite easily erupt when, you know, one or two people are working a lot. But because we're not hiding away from the fact that, oh, we're super busy and we can be really stressed. And we meet each other and go, we're super busy and really stressed. Like, let's plan things. Let's make time for stuff. Because what I see with a lot of couples is what they do is they're both kind of in this modality of being stressed and working a lot. And they don't really want to acknowledge it. So they just continue down the path. And maybe one of them does. and tries to do things, and maybe there's some resentment that kind of builds or some finger pointing that happens. So I think we've really learned from the clients that we have in like how to kind of manage this situation kind of as best we can. But, you know, we're human beings. Like we keep saying, like, we're far from perfect, you know. We may be able to kind of talk a good game because we, you know, we've done the training, we've had the tools and so forth, but implementing everything, you know, we're human beings. We're at best, we're going to get things right, I don't know, 60% of the time.
Yeah, 60% is a great number. Yeah, don't say just, right? 60% is great. Yeah, you can be winning that long. No, and I hear you, and I think that especially in the culture that we live in, that is very like results driven, product driven, grind culture is really strong, right? And I think it's really important too to remember what's important and what do you really want in the long term, right? And you know, because if you're your own boss, then you could grind until you die, right? You could absolutely be waking up early, staying up late, working 12-hour days every day for the next 50 years if you wanted to, right? But what's the balance, you know? And you know, what's the end goal? And working those long hours absolutely makes sense when you're building something that gives you freedom and flexibility, and you get to be more selective with how you spend your time. I mean, I went from a sales job where I did 20 out of state trips a year to coaching. And so my experience was very different in that all of a sudden I'm planning my whole day. All of a sudden I'm home all the time. I'm a single parent. So all of a sudden I'm way more present with my child, and I can be way more present for partners as well. I'm not out of town. Sorry, out of town partners, but you know, I'm here, I'm grounded. So yeah, I get you. And it's a balance. And I think the most important thing is that you both understand what the goal is for balance. Where is the balance? Where do you want to be? And that you're on the same page.
Yeah. And it is that being on the same page, and that comes through like regularly checking in and being like, what are we creating? Like, where are we trying to get to? Like, those sorts of conversations in my past relationships would have been so difficult. You know, they've really like, because I was, you know, commitment phobe, really. So like conversations about like, where do we want to be in 5 years, or what sort of life do we want to create for our family and things like that. I'd be like, oh, like, I feel like I'm being trapped. Like, I really did. Whereas now I'm like, yeah, like, let's have this conversation. And though I still feel the same emotions, right? There's still fear around freedom and so forth. I will lean into those emotions and feelings and stay there and have the conversation, because I know that also is what I want. It's what's important to me. Mm-hmm. But it also then supports the support that occurs on a kind of day-to-day basis. Like, you know, my partner knows that I might be working, you know, 6 days a week, but it's not just I'm doing this kind of with a plan of doing this endlessly, you know. Mm-hmm. It's like, we're building something together so that our life in the longer term kind of swings the opposite way, the pendulum, where there's kind of more time and more freedom and location freedom and so forth. And because we're on the same page, we've had these conversations and we talk about it. I wouldn't say we talk about super regularly, but reasonably regularly. And I guess regular is like, you know, it means different things to different people, but it means that we don't kind of get into kind of frustration and anger and resentment so easily, because it's like, what are we moving towards? We're moving towards something beautiful that we both want, like a shared vision, I guess, more than anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Share the vision, you know, check in, make sure the vision lines up. Absolutely. And I want to commend you too for like being an example of really leaning into that fear and discomfort, right? Like, I think a lot of times when I'm working with a client, they'll say, how do I get rid of this fear? And that's really not the question. The question is, how do you do what you want to do what you feel is the right thing to do, despite the fear, even though the fear is present, right? And so that's what you've explained here. You're not all of a sudden not commitment phobic. You're just not letting the fear dictate what choices you make.
Yeah, exactly. It goes back to that old book. Feel the fear and do it anyway. You know, it's the in the title there. It's like, oh yeah, I still, and that was something that happened to me years ago, right? Is that I would get the fear of commitment, the fear of feeling trapped, or the fear of feeling like I was being told what to do, would stop me in my tracks. To be like, I took the fear as an indication that I should stop.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm experiencing some fear. That means that I should stop. And I guess part of the work, the self-development work, is realizing that that fear is just an indicator of possibly somewhere that I can lean into and learn something new, or possibly an indicator of some sort of belief that I'm holding from the past that may no longer serve me as an adult.
Sure, sure. It also could be an indicator of something that's exciting, right? Like we never get afraid when there's nothing on the line, right? We get afraid when there's something to lose, when there's something to gain. And so, Mastering Fear was a really powerful book for me. And they talk about using fear as an indicator of what is actually important. You're having fear about these commitment conversations. That actually is an indicator that there's really something exciting going on, and your excitement is being interpreted negatively instead of being interpreted positively, just because of where old history and resources and all these things, right? But if you're going to play a game that's important, you might be afraid. But if the game has nothing to gain and lose, then there's no reason to be afraid, right? So we can almost use fear as a positive indicator. I mean, you talk about it using it as a negative indicator, right? Where say, okay, I'm afraid, that means something's wrong, I should stop. You could also turn it around and say, okay, I'm afraid, that means something really exciting is happening. I really want to be here. Let me come back to this space. Let me sit in this space and really see what it is that's exciting, what it is that's wonderful, and really see how I can make that part of my life.
Yeah, I really love that. Because it's kind of, we see fear as something to be avoided. I know, like in our being, in our body, when we're relating to fear as being like the tiger or the snake, it's understandable that we will experience that as like, okay, there's a tiger over in that bush. Don't go over to the bush. You can understand that, right? That's life or death. But when we're thinking about, like, I don't know, commitment, or I'm thinking of my clients now, it's like approaching a woman in a bar. It's like, wait a minute, that fear isn't going to lead to your near and sudden death. That fear is like, wait, this, as you put it, it's like there's something exciting, there's something on the line there, and it's really important to reframe that as like, this is actually something I can lean into, because this will enhance my life. This will maybe allow me to expand as a human being, as a person, and this might have benefits in other areas of my life as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Terrifying is exciting. So if you're not doing scary things, you're missing out. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, David. What can people do to get a hold of you? What you've got a coaching practice, you've got a podcast. How can people find that out?
Yeah, so probably 3 ways, probably best to find me. So if you're on Instagram, that's my most common hangout and place to be found. You can find me at @theauthenticman_. The podcast you can just find, everywhere where podcasts are found. The Authentic Man with David Chambers. Or you can find me via my website, which is www.theauthenticman.net.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, David. Pleasure having you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ezra.
Thanks for watching the Ask Ezra Intimacy Coaching Podcast. Support our show at patreon.com/askezra. Join us at the personal growth tier and receive a special thank you on the next podcast episode. A very special thank you to both Sarah Nash and Deb Matson for being Patreon supporters at the personal growth tier and helping make the Ask Ezra Intimacy Coaching Podcast possible.